Hey, Thrilling Suspense fanatics. Today's selection comes to us from Brian Craig, who is also called Brian Stableford. I continue to believe that his writing of the Bretonnia setting in the kind of original Warhammer Fantasy roleplay years is very, very much like Clark Ashton Smith's Averoigne setting. This story continues those parallels. The grim humor, the extent to which people's proclivities and obsessions beget their dooms is very Clark Ashtonian and in there. But the forest is vast, and there are many others who have sought solace and shelter in its wilder parts. Among them bad and dangerous men who have increased the burden of evil and suffering which lies upon the world we love. Most of the men who live on the fringes of the forest are honest worshippers of Tal, and many of those who live closer to its heart still follow caring traditions of the old religion. But there are parts of the forest which are hosts to the worshippers of darker gods, and to those who make treaty with daemons. One such tainted area is to be found in the lower reaches of the steep mountains called the Vaults, which I was taught in my youth to avoid, because the wood elves do not teach without explanation. They told me all that the wisdom of lore and legend had to say about the place, and it is one tale from that legacy which I will tell you now. It is one of that sad multitude of tales which warn us to beware of the wiles of those demons which are sent by wicked gods to seduce and torment us. On one of the lesser crags of this region, near a town called Cylindra, there stood a fortified manse, which was a center of forbidden worship until the king who was great-grandfather to our own beloved Charles appointed his favorite knight, Lanval de Valancourt, to lead a crusade against the Daemonkin. All good Bretonians have heard the story of that great adventure, and you will know already that Lanval's courage prevailed at last against the evil magic of the sorcerer Chemist Kesula. But the versions of the tale you have heard from other tellers undoubtedly ended with the moment of Lanval's victory, and with the implication that all has been well in Cylindra's demesne since it was achieved. Alas, it is a truth which we too often forget, that the shadows of evil cast by dark magic often linger long after the destruction of the magicians themselves. It was because he knew this that Lanval de Valancourt, having acquired the estates of Chemist Kesula by right of lawful conquest, caused the fortress to be razed to the ground and its stones scattered about the mountainsides by his men-at-arms. Lanval never set foot among the ruins again, and when the time came for him to die, which he did in his bed, as all heroes deserve to do, though few achieve it, he advised his son Guillaume to leave it alone also. Guillaume, being a wise man as well as a dutiful son, did as he was instructed. Guillaume lived 10 years less than his father, departing this life at the age of 52, and was misfortunate enough to die far from home, while fighting a campaign for his liege lord the king. In consequence of this, his own son and heir, Jehan de Valancourt, acquired the lands around Cylindra without receiving any solemn warning in regard to his use of them. All his knowledge of them, in fact, was drawn from the tales of his grandfather's glorious victory, which many storytellers, less scrupulous than myself, had altered somewhat for the purposes of prettification and flattery. Jehan so loved to bask in the reflected glory of his ancestors' heroic exploits that he took an early opportunity to visit Cylindra, and he was somewhat surprised to discover that the people of the town were less than grateful for the privilege of receiving him. He was a young man still, and had not quite understood how happy men can be when their liege lords live distantly and do not put them to the trouble of providing obligatory hospitality. When Jehan proudly rode up the slope to Themyscesula's blasted fortress to inspect the scene of his grandfather's victory, he was unlucky enough to be thrown from his horse. He fell awkwardly, spilling his head upon a square-edged stone. Though his skull was not broken, the wound never healed, and for the remainder of his life, Jehan was tormented by evil dreams and periodic bouts of madness, during which the ordinary light of day seemed to him to be eclipsed by a brighter and more colorful light whose constant changes made him dizzy with anxiety. Jehan became convinced that the ruins of Themyscesula's citadel were accursed, though whether he was mad or sane at the moment when he was persuaded of it, none can tell. For this reason, he inserted a clause into his will which said that the hill on which the fallen fortress stood should never be set aside from the domain of Cylindre, and should not be handed down to his own eldest son, who was called Lanfranc. Instead, the hill was given to the sisters of Shalia, the goddess of healing and mercy, in order that they should raise in that wild and tempestuous region a shrine of their own. By means of this device, Jehan de Valancourt sought to employ the power of the best and kindest of the gods to erase the memory and legacy of wicked Themyscesula, whose prayers had undoubtedly been offered to a very different deity. The sisters of Shalia were not entirely delighted to receive Jehan de Valancourt's legacy after his death. It was not that they feared any curse which might lie upon the land, but simply that the region was remote, and was home to very few followers of the goddess. The Council of Caron, after much deliberation, sent envoys to Lanfranc de Valancourt to say that the gift of land would not be useful unless he could also provide for the hire of a company of masons and carpenters to build a temple and a house upon the site. Lanfranc, despite that he harbored some slight resentment that the sisters should inherit the land which might have been his, agreed to assemble such a crew from those in his service, provided that the sisters would go to the hill with them, so that their prayers and their magic could provide protection against the effects of any curse which might lie upon the land. This was agreed. In consequence of these decisions, a company of sisters was dispatched from Quesnel, traveling up the river Brienne to the limit of its navigability, where they met the Valancourt builders, whose task it would be to build the stones of Themyscesula's ruined manse into a residence and a temple. The 9 sisters who were appointed to this mission accepted their lot, as they were bound by their vows to do, unquestioningly. Some, indeed, were pleased by the prospect. For Mother Thelinda, who was appointed the superior of the company, there was a welcome increase in authority to compensate for the disruption of her former life, and for the likes of Sister Penelope and Sister Mirica, neither of whom had ever taken to city life, there was the lure of the forest and the fresh mountain air. But there were also those whose uncomplaining acceptance masked a certain unease, and one of those was Sister Adalia. Adalia was 22 years old, having served Shalia for 8 years. She was the daughter of a craftsman glassworker in the service of the governor of Quesnel, who had attracted the attention of a priestess of Shalia by virtue of an unusual aptitude for spell casting, which she had shown as an adolescent. Alas, her aptitude had failed to mature with her body, so that her cultivated skills proved nothing out of the ordinary. This disappointment had not detracted from Adalia's loyalty towards the goddess while she remained in her native town, where she was close to her relatives, and where all the best houses boasted at least one window made by her father. She was stern in her determination to avoid curiosity about what might have become of her had she taken a different path in life. She never asked herself whether it was right and fair that the dull woman she now was should inherit the consequences of decisions made by the overeager and falsely promising girl she had once been. When she was commanded to leave Quesnel, though, she soon became conscious of a certain emptiness in the secret chambers of her heart which her prayers and acts of charity could not begin to fill. The hardship of the early days in the slopes above Cylindra could not help but magnify any unease which the sisters felt. Although it was summer, the weather was often chilly and damp, and though the builders worked as fast as they could to erect 2 big houses, one for themselves and one for the sisters, their progress was slow. The huge black stones which had formed the walls of Chemist Kesula's citadel were very difficult to shift and raise, even with block and tackle, and the tall trees, which had to be felled for timber, had hard, dark wood which blunted the carpenter's drills and saws. In the meantime, the whole company shivered in their tents. Adalia, though she was far from being the tallest or the strongest of the sisters, was instructed to help the workmen in their lighter tasks, fetching and carrying for them or mixing mortar. The work was so hard that her back always ached and her hands often bled, and though her magic won her some relief from such sufferings, there was always more work to renew them. Miraca, seeing her distress, told her gently that the sunlight and the fresh air would soon bring color to her cheeks and more strength to her limbs, but Adalia could discover no such change in herself as the long days went by. The sisters and the workmen moved into the 2 houses as soon as the roofs were in place, though they were by no means entirely finished. Each of the sisters was allotted a room, bare-floored and bare-walled, with a pallet on which to sleep and 2 candle brackets set on either side of a slit window. So black was the stone of which the walls were made, so narrow were the windows, and so poor were the candles manufactured in Cylindra, that these rooms seemed at first to be dreadfully gloomy. Adalia's room was in the 2nd story. Beneath the eaves it faced north, so that the sun never shone directly through the narrow window, and it overlooked a stand of uncommonly twisted trees whose tattered crowns seemed to mutter arcane imprecations when stirred by the wind. It was by no means as comfortable as the room which she had occupied in Quesnel, whose walls had been hung with tapestries depicting flocks of flying doves, and whose latticed window had faced the rising sun. But she had resolved that she must not hate it, and it was certainly a relief to possess some space that was all her own after weeks of sharing a tent. Mother Thelinda instructed that each of the sisters must make her room a fit place for prayer, first by staining the dark walls white, then by inscribing on their surface the sacred symbols of Shalia, a heart of gold, a white dove in flight, and a tear-shaped drop of blood. Though none complained, all found difficulty in executing this task, for the black stones which had once protected Chemist Kesula were resistant to the stain of purity, and whitewash had to be applied several times over before the walls would condescend to be lightened. Adalia found the task particularly frustrating, but in the end achieved a shade of gray which did not seem intolerably grimy. By this time, the white habit which she wore seemed to have lost its crisp cleanness forever, and no matter how she scrubbed it, she could only bring it to the same shade of gray which she had contrived to impart to the walls of her room. It was little comfort to her that all the other sisters had the same difficulties to afflict them. The people of Cylindra were not ungrateful for the sisters' presence, for they had heard what power the devoted followers of Shalia had to cure the sick and ease pain. Mother Thelinda received a steady stream of pleas for aid, which never went unanswered, though no price was asked for such assistance. The villagers began to send gifts of food and livestock, and by this means the sisters acquired a flock of chickens and a milking goat. They also became inheritors of the rich tradition of cautionary tales and rumors which had been handed down to the people from the times when Chemist Kesula had been their oppressor. Among these stories, There were the usual horrific accounts of cannibalism and child sacrifice which inevitably accumulate about those of sorcerous inclination, and the usual flights of fancy regarding storm-riding daemons and monsters of the night, but there were other items too, more unusual and idiosyncratic, some of which were contained in sayings and warnings whose import was no longer properly understood. One apparently pointless tale alleged that Themyscesula had made alliance with a tribe of dwarves which had forsaken the worship of Grungni in order that another god might teach them the secret arts of crystal making, and one mysterious instruction, known to every child in Cylindra, though none knew what it meant, bade all who dared to walk upon the mountain slopes to beware the glorious light which floods the hidden valleys of the soul. The sisters of Shalia were no ordinary women, but they shared the delight which all women have, which men also share, if the truth be admitted. In fearful fancies and ominous whispers, they repeated these tales avidly to one another while they worked, and though they laughed to show what little fear they had of the daemons with which long-dead Themyscesula had once made pacts, there was always a tiny thrill of anxiety in their laughter. Although work still remained to be done on the houses when the sisters had whitened their walls and inscribed the sacred symbols of their faith, plans had already been made for the erection of the temple. After careful consultation with the masons, Mother Thelinda had decided that this would be sited on a square platform overlooking a steep and densely thicketed slope. Here the eastern tower of Themyscesula's fortress had stood, and the first task facing the temple builders was clearing the rubble from the site. There were few huge stone blocks here, but there was a great accumulation of smaller debris which had long been overgrown by mosses, lichens, and ferns. Once the obscuring cloak of vegetation had been stripped away, it quickly became clear that there might be useful things to be gleaned from the wreckage. No doubt the people of Cylindra had made some effort over the years to search for weapons and items of commercial value, but they had not been troubled to steal away such commonplace things as wooden bowls and clay goblets, or bronze cooking implements and copper sewing needles, for which the thrifty sisters of Shalia could easily find a use. Mother Thelinda therefore appointed Sisters Adalia and Columella to the task of sifting through the debris as it was exposed and cleared, to recover and repair anything which could be put to use. This was a duty which Sister Adalia found at first to be much more to her taste than fetching and carrying. It was far less wearying, and the pleasurable possibility that a new discovery might at any time be made was ample compensation for the dullness of most of the work involved. The work had its less pleasant side, for the artifacts buried in the rubble were sometimes to be found in association with grisly reminders of the fierce conflict which had raged within the fortress when Lanval had invaded it, but Adalia was not afraid of skulls and skeletons and parchment-like fragments of skin. It was not Adalia herself who discovered the first pieces of colored glass. They were brought to her by a workman who thought them odd, though he did not realize that they might be valuable. But the glass-worker's daughter knew well enough how rare and precious stained glass is, and quickly realized that the fragments must have come from a window. She demanded to be taken to the place where the shards had been found, where she began to rummage about for others. When she found several more shards, some the size of fingernails and others the size of copper coins, she immediately commanded the workman to set aside his spade and proceed more carefully. She asked him to collect all the pieces of glass which he could find, and any strips of lead which might have been used to bind them together. In the meantime, she hurried off to tell Mother Thelinda what she had found. Mother Thelinda was less enthusiastic than Adalia expected, though she was city-bred and had seen stained-glass windows in the houses of noblemen. She had never looked at the windows of Quesnel with the same proud and interested eyes as Adalia. In fact, she considered such decorations to be mere frippery. "I suppose you had better collect all you can," said the superior dismissively. "If it can be of use or value to somebody, perhaps we can make a gift of it to Lanfranc de Valancourt, to appease him for the loss of his craftsman. He seems to be the kind of man who might take pleasure in toys and baubles, and I dare say that he has a clever window-maker at his beck and call." Adalia was annoyed that her discovery should be so casually minimized, and, as it seemed to her, her father also. However, she took what had been said to her as permission to make an effort to recover as much of the window as she could. She therefore gave Columella and the workmen instructions to be very careful in working near the spot where the first fragments had been unearthed, and to save all the shards which they found, no matter how tiny. For the rest of that day and all of the next, she waited fretfully nearby, ready to pounce on any glint of colored light which showed as the rubble was scraped away from the rock beneath. By the evening of the second day, she had hundreds of pieces of glass and dozens of pieces of the lead which had once secured the pattern of the window. The idea was born in her mind that if she could recover a sufficient number of fragments, she might eventually be able to reconstruct the pattern of the window, enough of it, at least, to know what had been depicted there. She had no delusions as to the difficulty of the project, but she felt compelled to make the effort, so she cleared a space on the floor of her room and began to lay out the pieces there, shuffling them around in the hope that she might begin to see some semblance of order amid the chaos. After an hour's pondering, which somehow used up the time which she would have spent at her private prayers, Adalia was forced to admit to herself that the task seemed hopeless. Although she had collected a good many fragments, many of them quite large, it was obvious that they were only a small fraction of the number into which the window had been shattered. She readily guessed that the vast majority of the remaining fragments must be very tiny and would be difficult to recombine even if they could ever be found. Because she had no idea what the pattern had looked like, it was hard to know where to start in trying to rebuild it. More fragments of colored glass turned up on the next day, and a few more on the next, but by now the workmen had completed the preparatory work of clearing the site, and it was obvious that no more pieces would be thrown up by the appointed routines of labor. Adalia turned her attention to the heaps of earth which had been shifted from the great platform, and to the cluttered slope which had descended from its rim. She knew that much of the original rubble from the felling of the tower would simply have been tipped over the edge, and she knew that some of the glass from the window must have gone with it. But the slope was very steep, and the workmen had no intention of clearing the undergrowth from it. Mother Thelinda soon relieved Adalia and Columella of the task of sorting through the debris on the grounds that everything useful had now been recovered, and gave Adalia, who still seemed too pale and frail for heavy work, a list of domestic duties to be carried out in the house. Adalia had no option but to accept them, but found that the duties were sufficiently lenient to allow her a few hours of spare time even during the hours of daylight. She began to use these hours in looking for more fragments of glass, wherever she thought they might be found, and soon she found enough, day by day, to make her feel that it was worth her while to persist in the task. Indeed, she came gradually to believe that she had a special instinct which guided her search and might eventually bring it to a successful end. As summer gave way to autumn and autumn to winter, the hours of daylight decreased and those of darkness expanded. This reduced the amount of time which Adalia could devote to her search for pieces of glass, but increased that which she could devote to the attempt to figure out how the pieces she already had might be connected with one another. This puzzle became very absorbing indeed, so much that it routinely absorbed the time which should have been given to her devotions. But when Mother Thelinda once suggested to her that she might be neglecting her prayers, she denied the charge vehemently. There were several occasions when she was brought to the brink of despair and became convinced that the project was hopeless, but on each occasion her half-formed resolution to give it up was subverted by a sudden gleam of inspiration which showed her how a group of pieces might be slotted together, or where a junction in the lead could be reconstructed. 8 years as a servant of Shalia had taught her many things, including the value of patience, and an occasional happy discovery was enough to persuade her that the task should not be abandoned. While the pieces remained scattered on the floor of her room, she could never leave them alone for long, but was always drawn irresistibly back to the puzzle. Her moments of insight gradually accumulated into an emergent understanding of the form and organization of the original work of art. She discovered that the window had been circular, and that there had been several concentric circles within the outer one. She deduced that the paler-colored glass belonged mostly to the outer circles, with more vivid blues and roseate shades closer to the center. She realized that the innermost circle had contained a detailed image of some kind, perhaps a representation of a bird with bright plumage. Each of these discoveries reinforced her resolution and encouraged her to increase her efforts, which she began to do by denying herself sleep. It was soon noticed, however, that Adalia burned more candles than any of her companions, and she was summoned to the superior to explain why this was so. She took Mother Thelinda to see her work, sure that the sight of the partially reconstructed window would be sufficient explanation and excuse, but the superior had no notion of it as an intriguing puzzle to be solved, and could not see the picture emerging within the confused array of lead and glass. Mother Thelinda saw the broken pattern only as a silly and trivial mess, and said so. "You must see, Sister Adalia," she said, in a gentle and kindly fashion, "that the objective cannot be worth the effort. What could you possibly gain by completing a task whose achievement would bring no worthwhile reward? You must understand that it is not fitting for a priestess of Shalia to become obsessed with worldly things. A window of colored glass, however beautiful, is only a window on the everyday world. Our concern is to bring the mercy of Shalia to those who suffer grief and pain, not to play with ornaments." Adalia accepted these rebukes very mildly, but her penitence was feigned, and she was glad that Mother Thelinda did not think to offer a specific instruction commanding her to abandon her work. Nevertheless, she did resolve to try harder to perform these observances which her faith required of her. For some days she was unable to collect more than a handful of very tiny fragments of glass from the slopes beneath the burgeoning temple, nor, in those few days, did she use more candles than any of the other sisters. But her enthusiasm for her task was not really lessened at all. Almost every piece of glass which she found was now the cause of a tangible thrill, for she was very often seized by the conviction that she knew exactly where her new find would fit into the growing whole. The outer circles of the window came steadily nearer to completion, and soon she redoubled her efforts once again in searching for the missing fragments. When the outer circles had been restored, save for a mere handful of fugitive shards, a most astonishing thing happened. There began to emerge from those outer rings of glass, during the hours of deepest darkness, an uncanny glow, which grew by degrees into a flickering silvery radiance. It was as though the window was no longer laid out on a solid floor at all, but had been set in place to transmit the effulgence of a dawn-lit sky. Had Sister Adalia been less absorbed in her project, she might have been made anxious by this mystery. She might have remembered that this window had not been an ornament in some nobleman's pretty palace, but a part of the fortress of Chemist-Kesula, where it might conceivably have had some other purpose than mere decoration. She might even have recalled to mind that curious warning about glorious light which had passed through the company as an item of idle gossip. Had she been able to think in this way, she would then have understood that her duty to Shalia demanded that she consult her superior at once, but her mind was filled by now with other thoughts and desires, and she had already acquired the habit of secrecy. As things were, the thought which first sprang into her mind when she saw this radiance was that it would help her to save candles and thus be freed from further pressure to abandon her self-appointed task. Her stratagem worked well. Mother Thelinda was satisfied with what appeared to be a return to normal conduct, and Sister Adalia was trapped in the unfolding web of her deceit, unable now to seek advice about the significance of the eerie light which lit her room for a few hours on either side of midnight. She did not feel as if she was imprisoned by her deceit. Indeed, she felt more contented than she had ever been before. It was as if that emptiness within her being, of which she had only been half aware, had been filled as neatly and cozily as it could be. She was now possessed of a completeness which all her sincere and heartfelt prayers to Shalia had somehow never provided her. Most of the pieces of glass to which her instinct had led her as she patrolled the slopes beneath the temple were rosy or blue in color, and the reconstruction of the circles where they belonged soon progressed to the point where almost every piece could be put unhesitatingly into place. And as these inner circles neared completion, they began to add their own measure to the light which poured into Sister Adalia's room in such a magical fashion. Adalia loved that light, which was certainly very beautiful, and delighted in studying its many changes. It was not in the least like true sunlight, for it had a ceaseless ebb and flow in it. What had earlier been a casual flickering was now a more tempestuous agitation. Whenever she knelt beside the window, bending over it in search of the place where a particularly problematic shard belonged, her many shadows would move on the whitened walls behind her like a troop of wild dancers capering about a magical fire. The dingy walls of her room were quite transformed by the light of the shadow. Their grayness was utterly banished by it, and the sacred symbols of Shalia's worship were completely blotted out. So too was the dreary grayness of her habit redeemed, for the light made it blaze with brightness, as though it were not a priestess's robe at all, but the colored costume of some mighty wizard of the colleges. Of the figure in the center of the picture, however, Adalia could as yet see almost nothing. There were only a few fugitive pieces of glass which seemed to belong there, which gave the merest impression of feathery form. Without any proper indication of the configuration of the wings, nor the least sign of beak or eye, no light came, as yet, from the innermost circle of the window. Adalia's quest was nearly brought to an abrupt conclusion when Sister Penelope and Sister Mirica, who chanced one night to be out and about at an unusual hour, reported seeing strange lights in her window. Adalia was summoned yet again to see the superior. She became very anxious that her work must cease, and she stoutly denied that anything unusual had occurred. She insisted that she had been asleep at the time that the light was reported, and knew of no possible source from which it could have come. Because Penelope and Mirica could offer no tentative explanation of their own, Adalia's word was accepted, but Mother Thelinda took the opportunity to question her further about the fate of the stained glass which she had collected. Adalia denied that she was any longer interested in the reconstruction of the window, and said that in any case no sizable pieces of glass had been found for some considerable time. Because the latter part of the statement was true, the whole was believed. After this interview, Adalia took the precaution of hanging up a dark cloth to curtain the narrow window of her room while she worked, and always left the greater window on the floor covered by a rug when she went out. That Mother Thelinda believed Adalia's story was in part due to the conviction with which she told it, but also to the fact that she had seemed so healthy and cheerful nowadays that it was impossible for any of her fellows to believe that she was going without sleep. When the sisters had come to Cylindra, and for some time after, Adalia had been pinched of feature and pasty of face, and far from being the strongest of the company, but now her skin was tanned and lustrous, and her laughing eyes were as bright as a bird's. Her companions could only think that it was the sunlight and the air, and the hard but willing labor which were at long last changing her for the better. Adalia no longer fell eagerly upon the few tiny slivers of glass which were occasionally found while work on the temple proceeded. Indeed, she professed indifference from them, one way or another, though the fragments disappeared into her sleeves and pockets and were carried anxiously, at the end of each evening's communal rituals, to the privacy of her room. There, the periphery of the innermost circle was slowly filled in, and she waited with rapt anticipation for the vital moment when the light which streamed through the outer circles would spread to the center, when that enigmatic image would, as she thought of it, catch fire. She lived for that day. Nothing else seemed to matter at all. Unfortunately, the central motif remained irritatingly absent. There were a few fragments of glass which seemed to represent feathers, and enough lead to imply that the figure was the head of a bird, but of the beak and eyes there was still no trace. By now she had searched every inch of the slope beneath the burgeoning temple most assiduously, and she knew that there was little hope of finding anything but tiny fragments there. Without the vital pieces there was little more of the puzzle to be done, and nothing to occupy her hands and mind in those hours when the light of another world filled her room with its gorgeous colors. Her old habits reasserted themselves, but when she prayed, without taking care to specify which deity it was to whom she addressed her prayers, she prayed only for a gift and a revelation. Her prayers expressed the yearning of her obsessive heart, which had no other object of affection than the face in the center of the window. For 7 times 7 nights the light waxed and waned, and each time it died, Adalia went meekly to her bed. But on the next night she was so filled with the glory of the light, she was utterly entranced, and was driven out by the fierceness of her hunger, out of her room and out of the house. Winter had come by now, and the night was bitter. Snow falling on the slopes, its whiteness all but invisible in the cloudy night. But she did not feel cold at all, and made her way unerringly to the site of the temple, which was nearly complete. In the courtyard of the temple, someone was waiting for her. He carried no lantern, and she could not see his face, but she knew by his stature and his voice that he must be a dwarf. "I have something which you want," he said. "And you have something which my master desires. Will you make a contract of exchange, so that your heart's desire might be answered?" "I will," she said. She felt as though she was lost in a dream, and in dreams one does not ask too many questions. "Here is what you need," said the dwarf, and she felt a rough and hairy hand as he gave her a parcel of rags which had something hard and sharp-edged within it. As the other turned to go, Adalia said, "Take whatever I have to give in return," and he replied, "It is already taken." Then she took the parcel back to her room and carefully hid it away before she went to sleep. On the next night, when all had become quiet, she uncovered the window to let free its turbulent light, and took out her prize. She carefully unwrapped the bundle, exposing 100 pieces of colored glass and a few twisted slugs of lead. The fragments of glass were mostly small and misshapen, and it was clear that it would be no easy task to fit them together in the correct order. It had been a long time since she had so many new shards to work with, and she was delighted by the challenge. Her nimble fingers began the work of turning and sorting, flying as though impelled by an intelligence other than her own, and she felt meanwhile as though she was laughing inside. She was very quick in slotting the pieces into place, for each one seemed to know exactly where it belonged. The eyes she placed last, and when she placed them she knew that her work was finished, that, although 100 tiny cracks and crannies remained in the grand design, she had done enough. Incandescent light sprang from the heart of the window, and the figure detailed there was suddenly present in all its resplendent glory. For a few fleeting seconds she still thought that the figure was the head of a bird, perhaps that legendary firebird which was still occasionally glimpsed above the cliffs of Paravon. Then she thought that it might be the head of a griffin, like the one displayed as a trophy in the great hall of the governor's palace in Quesnel. While its colors were still limned by curves of clotted lead, it might have been either of those things. But then, as the cataract of light poured through the window between the worlds, the lead which held the pieces of colored glass seemed to melt and shrivel, so that the image ceased to be an image and became reality. Then she saw that the central figure was neither bird nor griffin, nor any mere animal intelligence. Plumed and crested with gorgeous feathers he might be, but this was a person whose gaze was brighter with wisdom and knowledge than the eyes of any human or elven being she had ever seen. There was a tiny voice of warning within her, which tried to cry, "Demon!" in such a way as to make her afraid, but the voice seemed to Adalia to be no more than a tiny echo, feeble and forlorn, and, if, as she supposed, it was the last vestige of that love and adoration which she had once given freely to Shalia, then its insignificance now was clear testimony of the transfer of her loyalty to another power. The face which looked at her out of that other world which was so wondrously filled with ecstatic light was incapable of smiling, for the beaked mouth was set hard as if it was carved from jet. And yet she was in no doubt that he was glad to see her. She was perfectly certain that he longed to enfold her in his feathery embrace, to cover her tenderly with the splendor of his fiery plumage. The sheer beauty of the prospect overwhelmed her, and she threw wide her arms to welcome that transcendent embrace. Behind her, crowded upon the cold and narrow walls of that space which had been given to her for her allotted share of the world of mortal men, 100 colored shadows strutted and jostled, utterly unaware of their own thinness and insubstantiality, uncomprehending of the fact that they were mere whimsies of light from beyond the limits of the earth. Adalia, who had once been a sister of Shalia, gave voice to a liquid trill of pure pleasure, and those eyes which she had so recently restored to their proper place focused upon her an astonishing, appalling look of love, which was full of laughter and the joy of life. When Sister Adalia did not appear for morning prayer, Sister Columella and Sister Penelope were sent to inquire whether she was ill. They discovered her naked and supine upon the floor of her room, with her arms thrown wide open and legs apart. It was, they said, as though she had been seared from top to toe by some incredible fire which had burned her black. The walls of her room and her discarded robe were similarly black and ashen, and embedded in Adalia's vitrified flesh, sparing not a single inch of it, were thousands upon thousands of tiny pieces of glass. These colored fragments, as Mother Thelinda was able to observe when she was summoned by her horror-stricken messengers, gave Adalia's corpse the appearance of being encrusted with an extraordinary quantity of precious gems. Had they not known that it could not possibly be another, Columella and Penelope told their friends, they might never have guessed that it was poor Adalia. She had been so utterly transfigured by her mysterious death that she might have been anyone at all. The end. These colored fragments, as Mother Thelinda was able to observe when she was summoned by her horror-stricken messengers, gave Adalia's corpse the appearance of being encrusted with an extraordinary quantity of precious gems. Had they not known that it could not possibly be another, Columella and Penelope told their friends, they might never have guessed that it was poor Adalia. She had been so utterly transfigured by her mysterious death that she might have been anyone at all. The end. Something I really enjoy about Brian Stableford's work here as Brian Craig, and in turn perhaps as Orfeo, for is not the storyteller a stand-in for the storyteller? Oh man, it's getting meta. Something that I really enjoy about it is that he kind of sets us up to understand the constituent parts of a good story and to piece them together from fragments in a way that I really enjoy. Some of my favorite storytellers do that. And also, I think it's remarkable how well this story would situate itself in the world of Averoigne or in any medieval setting. It's both Warhammery in its Zinch-ness and also in keeping with the broader sort of history of weird fiction and of fantasy horror. It's for these reasons that I enjoy Brian Stableford so very much. And I hope you guys dug this story. If you did, go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, hit me with requests. I really enjoy this Oldhammer stuff, and Brian Craig is my favorite among the Oldhammer authors, because of the effects he can achieve. For the effects I can achieve, you should check out Thrilling Suspense Fantasy Volumes 1 and 2, available in print now via the links in the description box below. All right, thank you and have a great day.